think it's a question that maybe for Eduardo and Tracy. And it connects up with what Les Orsi was saying at the end of kind of the role of ideals and the way in which rhetoric within, and thinking of the Catholic Church as an international institution that's talking across not just cultures, but also different ways of thinking about rhetoric and what's the relationship between ideals and practical consequences. And so I was taken by just the thought of how sometimes we do end up being very US-centric in our way of imagining how we're talking through these issues. And so if you can just, Eduardo especially, but I think Tracy also, you've thought about this, if you can just reflect a little bit of when we try from a Catholic perspective to kind of zoom out and look at this, not just from the question of kind of global politics and global development and issues like that, but how do we talk across these types of rhetorical traditions as well? Because I think that's the source of a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of talking past each other when it comes to really understanding the core of the teaching as well.
You're asking about the relationship between the ideals that are articulated in Catholic teaching on contraception, for example, and then real practice.
For example, take Humanae Vitae, right? And so that's a document that's written not by an American, right? And so what does that mean as we're trying to figure out how to work through the consequences in a particular context in terms of appreciating the complexity? That's what I'm trying to get at.
Well, one of the many interesting things about Humanae Vitae, the argument made by the Papal Birth Control Commission, which recommended that birth control be reconsidered and made lawful for married couples, that it was not intrinsically evil and that couples could in good conscience practice birth control and choose their own method of birth control. That document and the discussions that led up to it were very, very concerned with this question of the common good, the good of the family, the good of the couple, and argued that the unitive function of married sexuality, which is that each member of the couple completes the other spiritually through sexuality as one of many forms of friendship. That this was in itself a good, and that it could be separated from the generative good, which sometimes beautifully completes that unitive good, but could be, the unitive function of sexuality could still be imagined as a good without that. And it assumed that because the practice of rhythm had been sanctioned, that you could make use of infertile periods for sex that was not intended as procreative, that this was just a natural next step. Humanae Vitae rejected that recommendation for change, but it still maintained an emphasis on what is good for the family, what is good for the couple, what is good for the larger society. Paul did not want to separate the unitive and generative functions because he feared that separating the unitive and generative functions would lead to misuses of sexuality. But he was so divided. He was very torn up over the question of his legacy, over whether this was the right thing. There's language in Humanae Vitae about we understand the hardships couples face. When the encyclical was announced, the Archbishop of I think in Munich said, nothing changes. Two priests don't. If couples in your diocese don't practice birth control, do practice birth control, continue to practice birth control. This is not an issue. This is not high on the list of evils in the Catholic Church. Pius had said to a group of hematologists, Pius XII, sometime in the 1950s, that contraception was legitimate as a way of addressing medical problems, as long as the intention was not to prevent conception. Ratzinger, Benedict, more recently has said that the use of condoms can be lawful to prevent the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. So emphasizing the good, what is the larger good? This is not foreign to Catholic thinking. But I fear that Eduardo is correct in some respects, that in pulling this issue out and in assuming it's a done deal, it's final, it's closed, there's no more discussion. Those larger questions of the general good are also foreclosed.
Yeah, except it's important to remember that the mandate is not a mandate to use contraception, right? I mean, because so the debate is not about the morality of contraception in the first instance, right? It's about, the moral judgment. I know,
the objection is, we're not going to be accessories to this.
But the moral judgment for which the religious exemption is being requested is not the moral judgment about contraception by itself, right? It's the moral judgment, which has to be prudential, right, about the proximity of purchasing insurance for your employees and that employee then going and perhaps using contraception on their own initiative at some later, right? And the idea that cooperation is too proximate, right? And that as a matter of our religious freedom, we can't be forced to engage in it, right? That's the claim that's being made, and so it's a weird kind of, to raise it in this context, right? It sort of sidesteps the whole question about the morality of contraception and focuses on this more narrow technical point. But it's odd. It's an odd claim, I think, to not to allow, say, every Catholic institution to assess that proximity on its own, right? To just say no, just kind of this is a bridge too far.
Greg?
I fear that that's a rather sanitized depiction of the claim. This notion of not being an accessory. When one has not a Catholic or other religious institution per se, but rather a religiously affiliated institution that plays in the secular space, makes rich contributions to the secular space, and benefits enormously in terms of its prestige and its influence because of its playing in the secular space and having secular employees and students and the like, and it performs this secular function of providing medical coverage, which in our society is basically a function without which, with all due respect to what Robin Wilson was saying, if Notre Dame exercised the nuclear option, it would suffer the consequence of those who fire nukes. You're generally going to be on the receiving end. Employees would depart in droves, and academics would depart in droves from Notre Dame. And so here is what I think is, in a less sanitized fashion, the use of the power of the institution over its employees and students in order to incentivize them to step in line with doctrine. Of course, that power is greatest for those employees and students who have the least means.
Yeah, I think that point, I think, is borne out a little bit by the continued opposition to the revised rule. Right, the idea that even if the insurance company and the sort of, I haven't seen good descriptions of why the revised rule is still objectionable, but there are. Robbie George has written about it, and it seems to be pretty tangled. But it's the idea seems to be a claim that because of our opposition, we the institution, right, to contraception, we are entitled to prevent our employees from independently contracting with an entity that we have contractual power over, the insurer, separately, right, to obtain contraception. And that does seem like just a pure power move, a kind of leveraging of the...
Some organizations of Catholic universities, I think this is right, someone should correct me if I'm wrong, I think that the organization of Jesuitly affiliated universities has accepted the terms of the revised rule.
Yeah.